Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Advancement Center and the continued reading of Volume 2 of The Magic of Life by Robert Young. And we continue with Chapter 3. There was not much chance of Bill putting the boat alongside for some hours with the tidal wave raising the general level of the water in the bay, so he dropped his anchor and wandered down to his so-called galley to make himself something to eat. The galley, in fact, was a box on deck with a few little bits and pieces stuck around it so that he could sit and make himself a meal. All the rest of the boat was built for fishing. It was possible to sleep on board, and there was a little stove that you could cook with, but generally, Bill was an outside man, and he arranged himself to be able to eat and fish at the same time. Bill sat down, made himself something to eat, pulled out the reserve water for a cup of tea, then sat back to feel the beauty of the world around him. He could feel in some way that there'd been a lot of changes right throughout the island, not only in the people and their living, but also in himself and his family. As he reflected on all the things that had happened over the past few months, what stood out most in his mind was the mystery of the words of Simeon that morning when he was in a half-dazed state and he could only wonder what it all meant. All the things that had been said seemed to be a confusion of some sort, but the biggest thing was that he understood that he would now be the main focus so that Suzanne could do the work that had been set out for her. Somewhere inside, he knew what that meant, but he had no idea how to express it. If someone asked him what it was all about, he would not be able to explain. Deep inside, Bill knew the importance of being associated with Suzanne, and he felt a deep love for her and her beautiful family. He wondered how he had survived without them and really couldn't imagine life without Suzanne. He really needed to get back to the jetty, even though the water was still high. After a little contemplation, Bill decided to pull in close and use the little dinghy to land on the beach, and then when the water lowered, he could pull it back down and bring the fishing boat back to its mooring. It seemed like weeks since he'd seen Suzanne, and although it was nice to be able to connect with her at a distance, he now needed to be close. All the events of the past few days, including the excitement of the sudden development of Suzanne's natural psychic powers and healing abilities, filled Bill's mind and heart. It was as if the momentum was dragging him forward at a rate that he couldn't handle. He had to be with Suzanne, and the family to experience what he felt was yet to come. There was so much happening that he needed Suzanne right alongside to maintain his stability. It wasn't long before the fishing vessel was moored and the little rowboat was in the water. Bill pulled hard on the oars and pulled hard against the tide that seemed to be rushing out against him. He hadn't taken into account that the water would be so active at this time, and he really had to stretch himself to overcome the flow. He pulled so hard that when he hit the beach, he catapulted out of the seat and almost tipped the boat upside down. Bill felt a little awkward. Everything seemed to be going so fast, and he didn't have the sense of balance and control that he normally had. There was something in the air causing this imbalance. There seemed to be something more about to happen. He looked around for something familiar. There were none of the familiar faces around the fishing village. No birds, no activity, and no noise, except for the quiet rumble of the volcano in the distance. There was just Bill and no one else. It was like the island was deserted. Bill quickly gathered his gear, tied the boat off, and headed towards his hut. He felt a bit strange arriving at the dock and not seeing Suzanne waiting for him. He had no idea where she was. His usual connection had disappeared, and he felt quite alone. As he approached his little hut, he realized that it was no use continuing. The shutters were down, and it was completely locked off. Suzanne had obviously been there before him and had locked and battened down the whole hut. The hut was so close to the water that if the tidal wave had come through in a different direction, the whole area would have been underwater, and the precautions that Suzanne had taken would have gone a long way towards saving the hut and its contents. Bill had no way of getting into the hut, so he turned sharply and headed towards the well-used path to their cottage. Suzanne lost contact with Bill for a short time and was feeling quite uncomfortable. She looked towards Jamie and wondered what had happened. "Can you feel Bill around, Jamie?" "Yes, Mummy. Bill's on his way," said Jamie. Samuel jumped up and down and repeated, "Bill's coming," while Martha, in her normal response to Bill's name, attempted to jump and clap her hands. Suzanne smiled. Bill felt a chill as the wind suddenly gushed, and he felt the perspiration evaporate quickly from his body. He looked around but couldn't see any cause of the wind. He had no feeling of connection except for the wind, and then suddenly another gust, and he almost fell over. He stopped and felt a strong communication from somewhere. The wind suddenly stopped, and there was an almighty crack through the land. Just in front of him, a rock split, and there was a 1/2-meter opening in the ground and a trembling rumble that he had never felt before. He turned quickly to see the dust rising as the crack accelerated up the hill towards his home. An enormous fear came over him, not for himself, but for his family. Bill jumped up and started to run. The wind lashed around his body again and stopped him in his tracks. He looked ahead to see another fault line rip through the ground in front of him. Bill stood still, not daring to move. He felt himself going white. It was at that point that he realized that everything was out of his hands, and his focus suddenly went to Simeon. Simeon answered him immediately. "Stay still and be calm. Everyone is being looked after." Bill's sense of protection for his family rose very quickly, but Simeon's voice was calm. The shivers that went through Bill's body gradually abated and settled as the noise of the land went down to a quiet rumble. Then, almost as suddenly as the faults appeared, the ground closed again, leaving a mark, but no real damage. Bill's senses were so high that he didn't know what to do next, and then the word came from Simeon. "Go up the hill by the old path, jump the first opening, and go through the tunnel. Your family is safe." Bill took a deep breath and found that he could hardly move. He had to bring himself back into his body, feel the pulse, and then connect back to everything in the physical world. He had almost left his body. In an instant, Bill was mobile, and he ran faster than he had ever run before. The old path was longer than his normal route, and there were rocks and rubble that had never been there before. He quickly evaded all the obstacles and got to the first tunnel that went under the old road and saw that it was partially blocked. He remembered Simeon's advice and ducked up to the next tunnel where it was clear all the way through. As Bill came out the other side, he felt like he was walking into a different world. It was calm. There were birds, regular noise from the trees, and even the little brook seemed to be undisturbed. Bill stopped and looked around and was about to look back through the tunnel when Simeon's words came again. "You have walked through into your own dimension, the one that is preserved for you. Don't go back." Bill smiled and felt his heart start to settle. Simeon's words held more than anyone could imagine. He could feel Suzanne and Jamie, Samuel and Martha. He felt safe and at home immediately. There were only a few more hills between him and the house, and he looked forward to rounding the last hill to see his cottage and his family. It wasn't long before he reached his favorite spot, and just as always, he rounded the hill to see them all standing outside the house, waiting for him as if nothing had happened. The weather was clear. The effects of the volcano had not even entered their field. As soon as Bill's eyes met those of Suzanne, the feelings flooded his body, and he started to run. Suzanne and the children did the same. Their meeting was extremely emotional, and neither of them could speak, while they held one another tightly, experiencing all the changes that had happened in their life. The children caught up to Suzanne and hugged both their legs. In a matter of seconds, they all started to laugh. It was a great occasion. Chapter 4. As they walked back to the house, Bill and Suzanne chatted freely, as they normally did, with an arm around each other. The children skipped alongside and played with the flowers that grew in amongst the beautiful green grass. They chased the small birds and laughed out loud with that joy that only comes from children. Bill and Suzanne were elated as they went through all the events that had happened while they were apart. Bill was so excited about the prospects of the island. They spoke about Suzanne's prospects and her ability to speak to anybody at a distance, and about Jamie and how she seemed to know everything before everybody else, including where people are and what they are doing without 1 ounce of effort. Their life was perfect and they loved their cottage, but they were also excited about what had been arranged for their future. The fact that Willem had turned out to be Heinrich Smithers, who owned most of Norwich, was a great thrill to both of them. It was no wonder Willem had been able to tell them so much about so many things. It was amazing the way everybody who had ever been involved with them had changed for the better, dropped all their old problems, and come out with total honesty and joy about working together. Their way of combining two parts of the island without really affecting the lifestyle of either proved to be amazing. As they prepared for their first meal together for what seemed like a lifetime, Simeon's presence in their cottage became very strong. They entered the living room, and the effect of him being there almost took their breath. The children went quiet, and Bill and Suzanne bathed in his presence. Neither of them said a word until Simeon spoke. "It is time for you to move. It is a bit earlier than we expected, and arrangements have been made for you to join the ship later next week. In the meantime, many new things will have to come into play, but all that will be done for you. During the time between now and your trip, I want you to enjoy your life and enjoy your new plans. You have a berth on the ship and you have accommodations on the mainland. It has been arranged that you will be picked up later in the week to prepare for your trip. So now enjoy your family and look forward to the adventure." Simeon's voice faded, and neither Bill nor Suzanne could speak. Their response was in their heart, and the joy of feeling Simeon's presence outweighed any problems associated with leaving their home. The whole family sat there for another 2 minutes before Martha jumped up and rushed over to get her baby koala that had been given to her at Christmas and ran back to Suzanne. "Koala goes too." Suzanne smiled and put her hand down to Martha. "Of course, my dear, we're all going." The days that followed were marvelous. Everything that Suzanne and Bill could ever imagine in their lives came that week. Jamie and her fairy friends entertained them every night, and Samuel grew very quickly. It seemed like he had advanced 2 years in the short time of 1 week, and little Martha followed along and entertained everyone. Heinrich Smithers sent a letter with a map, excusing himself for taking on the task without asking them, but advising of their passage on the ship next week. He advised how Bill would be one of the leading members of a group of advisors, and Suzanne and the family would be traveling as a separate entity, but in adjacent cabins. This was done to outsmart the restrictions that had been placed on travel to ensure that people stayed on the island, and married couples could not travel off the island unless they traveled at separate times. At any stage, at least one of them had to be on the island. Heinrich's letter was short, but the attachment was detailed. He had a map, a list of names of contacts and of subjects that Bill would have to speak about when he got to the mainland. Bill had only recently managed to be able to read all this information. With the help of Jamie, he had become quite good, but he couldn't imagine having to speak to well-educated people on the mainland about matters of money, trade, and human relations. But there it was in front of him in Heinrich's handwriting, signed at the bottom as an official document. Bill's response was far from what you would expect. He looked at the paper, looked at Suzanne, then at Jamie, stopped for a second, and then said, "Yes, we can do that." Suzanne jumped up and wrapped her arms around him. He felt so tall and so proud of himself that he could have done anything. He sat with the letter in his hand and felt the importance of the whole thing. He could see that they were about to embark on a new adventure that was totally controlled and set up by all the helpers from the other world. The world was Simeon and all those who had passed, including Joe Montgomery, his great friend, and many others who were looking after the interests of all those on the island at the present time. The days went quickly, and it wasn't long before they were facing the trip to Norwich, the luggage that they had anguished over, not knowing when they were coming back or even if they were coming back, and now become secondary. They even considered how they could trade their way through or whether they would have to spend their gold. These questions seemed to be without answer. However, each thing they packed seemed to happen with ease, and eventually they had a small stash of gold coins held by the children and one gold coin each held by them. The luggage became basic living utilities and nothing else. Their ability to get to the ship seemed a bit strained until the very man they never expected to see turned up in his old car. He looked like the original Willem, not like the new Heinrich Smithers, who owned half of Norwich. Very few people knew that it was possible to get from Bill and Suzanne's house to the town of Norwich. Willem was confident that they could travel up to the hidden valley that led its way down into town. It was a long trek, but by car, particularly with a narrow wheelbase, it was an easy trip that took less than a day. Without much effort, Bill, Suzanne, Jamie, Samuel, and Martha placed themselves in comfortable positions in the old car, and Willem strapped the luggage on the back. The trip started with a rush as the old car let out a bang and pulled them up the first hill across the old plains into the town. The turn off to the walking track was unexpected as the old car headed to where it was hidden by overhanging trees. Willem turned hard left and headed out into the depths of the island where Bill, Suzanne, and the children had never been before. Willem laughed when he saw the surprise on their faces as they headed into the center of the island. From where Bill and Suzanne lived, it seemed like this part of the world never existed. All they could ever see were hills. Between their cottage and the main hill was a beautiful valley that led its way across the island and eventually into Norwich. They stopped 5 times on the trip, and each time the children got out and played with new friends, new animals, even butterflies that came and sat on their heads and arms. The further they went into the island, the more comfortable they were with their surroundings. On the last stop, they found the historic animal friend of Henry Olsen, the beautiful leopard with the shiny eyes looking straight at them, just as Henry experienced many times when he walked through the hidden valley to the back of his house in Norwich. As soon as they arrived, Willem changed back to the character of Heinrich Smithers. It was like he had gone back 10 years to someone that Suzanne had never seen before. Heinrich was bright, cheerful, and very quick with all his statements. His thoughts rushed through his being with such force that you could see the wheels going around. Heinrich jumped in his seat as he saw his daughter Mary poking her head out from behind the bushes near her house. Henry appeared very quickly behind her, and the car stopped only feet short of them both. Mary rushed over and gave Suzanne a big hug, and Henry stood in line for the same. Henry was so pleased to see Bill again. He thought all his plans would to pieces when Bill would go to pieces when Bill left early the week before. But since then, everything had fallen nicely into place. All the food supplies had arrived. The hotels came back onto an even keel, and people started volunteering to repair the town. Bill's presence had been felt, and it was necessary for him to stay there to lead the events that he had so clearly prepared. It was not necessary for him to stay there to lead the events that he had so clearly prepared. Henry's smile was so big and bright that it impressed everybody. Bill turned towards him. "Henry, what's going on?" he said with enthusiasm. Henry couldn't contain himself. "We just bought the shipping line," and everybody gasped. "How could you buy the shipping line? It belonged to the mainland government," Bill explained. "Heinrich had an interest in the shipping line that he had handed to my father a long time ago," Henry said with a slight inflection in his voice. "And we just discovered it. It gave us the option to buy back the shipping line for as little as $100,000, and there is nothing anyone can do about it." Henry just shook his head and continued, "This is what your presence has done, Bill, and I know there'll be more. We now have the ability to expand to other countries." The size of such an announcement was overwhelming, but Bill simply stood tall and said, "That's great, Henry. Is the boat we're going on one of yours?" "Of course," said Henry, "but it's not one of mine, it's one of ours. This belongs to the island, and everyone on the island will receive equity as a result of the purchase." Suzanne couldn't believe her ears. She looked at Mary. "Did you know about this?" "No," said Mary. "This is the first time. I didn't even know that Henry was looking at it." Heinrich smiled and said, "Well done, Henry. I suppose we better get these people to the dock." Henry rushed around to the back of the car and undid all the luggage straps, while Mary and Suzanne gathered the children. Bill and Heinrich stood there looking at one another, both proud to know one another and both aware that they were more than they had ever expected to be in this life. The dock was noisy with all the cargo handling and forklifts moving backwards and forwards. Mary had never imagined a world like this could exist, and Suzanne stood there totally amazed. Everything was new, but she felt she had seen it before. It was like a picture of some futuristic image she saw but never understood. She looked at the children, and they took no notice. It was as if they expected what they saw. And amongst the noise, Willem appeared once again to give last instructions to Mary and to show Suzanne and Bill how to handle the tickets that he had in his hand. No sooner had he given the instructions to Mary, he reverted to the most efficient Heinrich Smithers, giving orders to the porters, the customs people, and the shipping agents to make sure that Bill and Suzanne were catered for correctly. Heinrich's words were clear and brisk as he quickly turned and announced, "Bill, you will be staying with me in my quarters." Suzanne smiled with relief, knowing that Bill would have Heinrich's support in all the ventures that he had ahead of him. There were many questions that Suzanne and Bill had never asked. They had not asked about the accommodations on the ship or even where the ship was going. The mainland had always been their reference, but they weren't sure what country that was. They had never been exposed to anything except the instructions that were given by Willem, who was now standing in front of them as Heinrich Smithers, totally engrossed in other things. And that ends chapter 4. And when I return, I will start with chapter 5 of The Magic of Life, Volume 2. Until then, I wish you a perfect life, perfect health, and a magic future. Thank you.